start in Tibet, where the Chinese authorities are advancing with an equal parts colossal and controversial hydropower project.
That's right. This is a project for a mega dam in the region of Tibet on the river called the Yarlung Tsangpo. Premier Li Qiang attended a ceremony to launch construction on the site near the town of Ningxi on Saturday.
High in the Himalayas, above many of Asia's biggest cities, China is trying to turn the roof of the world into a gigantic power plant. If the projects now underway in Tibet are fully built, a single river system could generate more electricity than some entire countries use in a year. And whoever controls that power does more than change their own energy future. They reshape the entire map of who depends on whom for energy in Asia. But here's the twist. This is not happening in a safe, flat desert. It is happening on a fragile, earthquake-prone plateau that also supplies water to nearly 1 billion people downstream. So is Tibet's mega hydropower a clean energy miracle, or a risky bet that could redraw the politics of Asia's rivers? Let's break down what is being built, how big it really is, and what it could mean for the future of power and water from China to Bangladesh. Tibet is often called Asia's water tower because so many major rivers start there. The Yangtze and Yellow flow into eastern China. The Mekong plunges towards Southeast Asia. The Yarlung Tsangpo sweeps along the plateau before diving through a deep gorge, then crossing into India as the Brahmaputra and eventually reaching Bangladesh as the Jamuna. Steep drops in elevation plus huge volumes of fast-moving water make these rivers some of the best hydropower resources on Earth. Chinese studies going back decades estimated that the Yarlung Tsangpo and Brahmaputra basin could support tens of thousands of megawatts of electricity generation. For a long time, most of that potential stayed on paper. Difficult terrain, limited demand in the region, and environmental worries slowed everything down. But as China races to cut emissions, expand renewables, and secure long-term energy supplies, those old plans are suddenly at the center of national strategy. China has already built a series of high-altitude dams on the upper Brahmaputra. One of the best known is the Zangmu hydropower station in Tibet. Its 6 turbines add up to about 500 megawatts of capacity and produce billions of kilowatt-hours every year, enough to meet the needs of hundreds of thousands of people in Tibet and Western China. Those are big numbers, but they are tiny compared to what comes next. Beijing's current planning documents talk about building large hydropower bases on the lower reaches of the Yarlung Tsangpo, essentially turning the deep canyon near the river's Great Bend into a new mega power hub. The flagship is the planned Medog hydropower station near the border with India. Public reporting and planning figures describe it as a project with around 60,000 megawatts of capacity and annual output, on the order of 300 billion kilowatt hours. That is roughly 3 times the output of the Three Gorges Dam and more than the total yearly electricity use of some mid-sized Asian countries. Chinese leaders have described the cluster of dams planned for this stretch of river as a project of the century. The idea is to capture the enormous drop in altitude as the river dives off the plateau, chaining together several power stations in a cascade that together become one of the largest clean energy engines on the planet. That is the scale of the bet. Turn a remote Himalayan gorge into a power plant that rivals entire national grids. But what does that do to the rest of Asia's energy system? Inside China, Tibet's rivers help solve 2 problems at the same time. First, they provide a massive new source of low-carbon electricity to support national targets for peak emissions and carbon neutrality. Second, hydropower can ramp up and down quickly, which makes it perfect for balancing wind and solar, which are growing fast but change with clouds, seasons, and wind speeds. Chinese planners talk about integrated energy bases in the West, where hydropower, wind, and solar all feed into the same high-voltage backbone. When the sun is strong and the wind is blowing, the dams can store more water in their reservoirs. When clouds roll in or wind drops, the dams can open their gates and send extra power down the lines to coastal cities and factories. Alongside traditional hydropower, China is also racing ahead with pumped storage projects. These are basically giant rechargeable batteries made of water. When there is surplus power, pumps push water uphill into a reservoir. When demand spikes, the water runs back down through turbines to make new electricity. China already leads the world in pumped storage capacity and plans to more than double it again over the next few years. Put it all together, and you can picture an energy conveyor belt. Himalayan rivers feed big dams. Those dams work with solar farms in deserts and wind farms on grasslands. Ultra-high voltage lines then move that electricity thousands of kilometers to data centers, apartment towers, subway systems, and industrial zones near the coast. That alone would redraw China's internal energy map, shifting more of the system toward renewables and away from coal. But the bigger question is, what happens beyond China's borders? The Yarlung Tsangpo does not stop at the frontier. Once it crosses into India, it becomes the Brahmaputra, one of South Asia's most important rivers for agriculture, fishing, river transport, and daily life. It then joins the vast river network of Bangladesh, supporting dense populations and fertile floodplains. When China first built the Zangmu Dam, Indian officials and experts worried that upstream projects might reduce dry season flows, change sediment patterns, or increase the risk of sudden releases. Beijing replied that Zangmu and several other stations were run-of-river plants with limited storage, and so would not significantly alter flows downstream. With a super dam like Medog on the table, the stakes feel much higher in New Delhi and Dhaka. Indian leaders have openly expressed concern about the scale of hydropower development on the upper Brahmaputra and the potential for future projects to affect downstream interests. Bangladesh has raised similar worries about water availability, fish stocks, and ecosystems in its low-lying delta. At the same time, India is launching its own hydropower surge. Plans call for hundreds of new projects in the Brahmaputra basin over the coming decades, tapping tens of gigawatts of potential capacity. Indian planners do not hide that one motivation is to avoid being left behind on a shared river where China is already building upstream. So Tibet's megaprojects are already reshaping decisions and investments in neighboring countries even before the first giant turbine spins. Now comes the big what if. At the moment, China uses Tibetan hydropower to feed its own grid. There is no large-scale export of electricity from Tibet to India, Nepal, or Bangladesh. That is the starting point, but across South Asia, a regional power trade network is quietly emerging. Bhutan has exported hydropower to India for decades. Nepal has shifted from being a net importer to exporting electricity to India, and has started sending power to Bangladesh through Indian lines under new deals. The idea is simple. Mountain countries with big rivers generate surplus power and sell it to energy-hungry neighbors in the plains. Energy researchers who model cross-border grids in South and Central Asia find that better interconnections could lower costs, reduce blackouts, and make it easier to integrate more solar and wind across the whole region. In that kind of future, Tibet's mega hydropower could, at least in theory, become part of a bigger puzzle, either directly or by freeing up other Chinese capacity that then gets traded across borders. That scenario is speculative right now. There are political, security, and technical barriers everywhere you look, but it is one reason governments and analysts watch every new step in Tibet so closely. Of course, huge opportunity comes with huge risk. Building a dam almost anywhere has consequences. Building one of the world's largest hydropower projects in a seismically active gorge carved through the Himalayas raises the stakes even more. Environmental organizations, Tibetan groups, and some scientists warn that the proposed sites sit in a region with frequent landslides, complex geology, and a history of major earthquakes. The worry is not just about the dam wall itself, but about the entire surrounding landscape. A strong quake or extreme rainfall event could trigger slope failures, debris flows, or chain reactions that stress the dam system in ways that are hard to predict. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty. The Tibetan plateau is warming faster than the global average. Glaciers that feed the Yarlung Tsangpo and neighboring rivers are retreating, and high mountain lakes are growing and sometimes bursting. In the near term, that can mean more water rushing into rivers. In the long term, it can mean more volatile flows, sharper extremes, and a higher chance of sudden flood events from glacial lakes. For people living downstream, the fear is not only that dams might reduce river flow in dry seasons, but also that bad management or extreme events could turn reservoirs into amplifiers of floods. Protests against big dams in India's own northeast, including projects on major tributaries, show that these concerns go far beyond China. Local communities often describe such projects as ticking bombs if safety, sediment and earthquake issues are not fully addressed. Supporters of Tibet's megadams argue that modern engineering, strict design standards, and real-time monitoring can keep risks under control. They also point out that coal plants, which hydropower can replace, create their own serious health and climate dangers. Critics counter that the combination of giant infrastructure, unstable mountains, and rapid climate change is a gamble with too many unknowns. Whenever a huge dam is announced on a shared river, headlines quickly jump to the phrase water wars. Yet many researchers who study the Brahmaputra basin say that full-scale conflict over water is unlikely. Instead, they see a higher risk of mistrust, angry rhetoric, and political tension. If countries do not share data, talk openly about operations, and agree on some common rules. So far, China and India have set up limited arrangements to share river data, especially about water levels during the flood season. But there is no full treaty on the Brahmaputra like the one India has with Bangladesh on the Ganges. Bangladesh has recently taken steps to engage more in global water governance, a signal that it wants stronger tools for dealing with upstream decisions by larger neighbors. The big question is whether Tibet's mega hydropower push nudges the region toward more cooperation or pushes it toward a quiet arms race of dams. Will we see more shared data, joint studies, and coordinated flood management, or more suspicion and one-sided construction rushes on every major tributary? That choice will do as much to shape Asia's future energy and water map as any concrete war. In practical terms, the story of Tibet's mega hydropower is still in its early chapters. Work has started on parts of the vision, but the full build-out will take many years. Engineering hurdles, environmental reviews, financing challenges, and political pushback could speed it up, slow it down, or change the design along the way. Meanwhile, the wider energy game continues. China is rapidly expanding wind, solar, and pumped storage across its territory. India is rolling out its own big hydropower plans in the northeast. Nepal and Bhutan are deepening their role as regional hydropower exporters. Bangladesh is searching for reliable imports while protecting its vulnerable delta. If you want to follow how this unfolds, keep an eye on a few things. How fast the Medog project and its sister dams move from plans to full construction. How transparent China is with downstream data. How many of India's announced projects actually break ground, and whether regional power trade deals grow beyond a handful of pilot agreements. Each of those decisions nudges Asia's energy future in a different direction. Tibet's mega hydropower is not just another dam story. It sits where three huge forces meet: China's drive to decarbonize and secure energy, South Asia's struggle to power growth without destroying the climate, and a warming world that is putting new stress on every shared river. Handled carefully, the dam above the clouds could power millions of homes and data centers, smooth out the ups and downs of wind and solar, and eventually fit into a more cooperative, cleaner regional grid. Handled badly, it could deepen mistrust, magnify climate and disaster risks, and endanger the very communities who live closest to the water. For now, the plateau remains both a powerhouse in the making and a giant open question. What happens on that high, fragile edge of the world will quietly help decide how energy, water, and power itself flow across Asia for decades to come.